from the coffee break. I'm pleased to introduce the third panel of today, the third and last panel. It's about from fragility to resilience, community-driven solutions for lasting urban change. And it will be moderated by Doucet Aubrey, who is the chief of the Office of UN Habitat for the European Union. Over to you, Doucet. I'll let you introduce your panelists.
Okay. Hello? Can you hear me? Yes. It's on, okay. Great, well, thanks very much for coming back after the break. And yeah, it's been an interesting morning session, and I'm just trying to organize my notes here. So, you know, when we're talking about fragility, there are a lot of different sort of definitions of fragility, and basically, I was just looking through this before the session, and it can be defined as the quality of being easily broken or damaged. And fragile settings are vulnerable to acute shocks like natural disasters, conflicts, disease outbreaks, as well as recurrent chronic stresses, seasonal environmental impacts, food insecurity, political and economic instability. And one thing that's also quite consistent is that in such settings, there's quite often the lack of institutional capability to respond to the cause of the fragility. So when we're looking at resilience then, one of the definitions that we can look on resilience is the ability of a system, community or society exposed to hazards to resist, absorb and accommodate and adapt to, transform and recover from the effects of a hazard. And this is the UN DRR definition. So what we're looking at here is that transition from fragility, really not being able to cope with the frequent events and these things that are the causal factors to a situation where you are able to deal with it. And we're looking really at, in this session, at how to empower communities and the role of communities in responding to situations of fragility. But I think what's also important, and I don't think has yet been touched on in this session, is that even while we're looking at communities and more broadly at cities, I think it's also important to step back and look at territories. Because fragility is not something that just occurs in isolation inside a city. It usually has a strong sort of territorial dimension. And I think there's a particular opportunity to look at. It was interesting to hear Erica Gerritsen this morning talking about this kind of convergence of climate impacts, conflict, also economic opportunities, people on the move, and how that's affecting cities. And often we see that when people move because of a crisis, cities suddenly grow. They can double or triple in impact. I worked a lot in Somalia. Baidoa, for instance, people have moved there because they feel safe. But it's doubled or even tripled in the last decade. And you see the water table sinking at a very rapid level. And we have to look at this territorially. And I think a huge opportunity, as was slightly touched on, is the role of small and intermediary cities. And I think we need to sort of start mapping at a territorial level what are the push factors of climate and what are the conflict and other effects, but what are the pull factors in terms of economic opportunities? And also, what are the sort of new investments being made? What are the sort of game changers, such as the corridors? We're talking about 11 corridors within the Global Gateway. And how do all these pieces of the puzzle align to create value chains from the economic point of view in terms of the role of small and secondary cities along corridors to have a role in the territorial economy, but how does that then provide solutions for climate change, because instead of moving all the way to Baidoa, if you're, you know, as we see in Somalia, a one-way direction, a resilience to the general impacts of climate change because of your proximity to a place of refuge. You might have a city where your daughter is working 20 kilometers from your rural homestead, and during a drought you could have a natural place of refuge while still being able to cope with, while still being able to keep an eye on your rural livelihood. At the same time then, since that's there, what are the kind of investments needed in energy and infrastructure to make this idea viable? How does that provide opportunities for people on the move? And I think we do need to then see resilience, and we need to see fragility through a very multi-sectoral lens at a territorial level that looks at climate, that looks at conflict, that looks at economic opportunities, looks at urbanization. And I think we've got a great opportunity with a global gateway to do that, so that the corridors that are being built are really genuinely adding value and creating solutions to many different issues, particularly around economy and particularly around migration and displacement. I think within that context is then important now to be looking at cities. I've been asked to look at communities in particular. But I think it's important that to not see this in isolation of a territorial phenomenon. So what UN Habitat has been working, we work in about 90 countries, and about 40% of the places that we work are fragile settings. For the last 2 or 3 decades, we've been working in such context, and we developed, I think, even the people's process in Asia, I think 25 years ago, where we're really acknowledging that communities are in the forefront of solutions to crises, and the role of community development committees in identifying solutions and in partnering with local authorities to implement them and owning them was a critical lesson learned. Even before the term nexus was talked about, etc., this was sort of work we were doing on the ground, and I think is still really valuable now. And I'm glad to be in Brussels. I've been in Brussels for the last 6 months, but previous to that, I was working in a lot of different crisis locations, starting from Kosovo to Sri Lanka during the tsunami, to Arab states, where I was working in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Libya, etc., and then more recently in Africa, and Burkina Faso and Somalia. What we notice is that you know, as people living in cities, we are never self-reliant on our self-reliance doesn't come from ourselves. We rely on the market to get food. We don't grow our own food. We rely on the municipal services. We don't all have our own well. We rely on the local industries and the business community and the business district for our jobs. Our ability to survive and to be self-reliant on the inner city depends on the functionality of the system of the city. And the city is basically a system of systems which are all interlinked. And our ability to work and why cities are attractive is because we are part of an ecosystem. And when this ecosystem breaks down, because of crisis, because of conflict, because of climate or whatever cause it might be, it's the breakdown of the system that makes us fragile. And equally, we're finding in Cities Alliance, UN Habitat, we work a lot in informal settlements. And in a way, that's also, there's a parallel there. And you could say that informal settlements are pockets within the city where that distribution, where the functionality of the system has broken down or is completely absent. So you can have perpetual fragility within cities, even in middle income, even in higher income countries that are not affected by conflict or immediately affected by climate, but simply by the way that the city or the system of city is managed. So there's a parallel there between the functionality of the city's system and where fragility occurs. And I think one thing that we've been working on in those crisis contexts then is, as Erica Gerritsen mentioned, is the urban recovery framework, where the key thing then is profiling, understanding spatially, how is the system functioning prior to the crisis? How is it functioning now? And what are and how are people coping? And what we found consistently is when the system breaks down, communities step up. We see that everywhere. And people's then ability to continue to exist, to be almost self-reliant in the situation of fragility, then doesn't depend so much on the system of the city working, but how the community is compensating for the lack of that system. And then the question then to ask, I think, then, is not so much, well, what do you need? Which is what the humanitarian response is. What do you need? You need shelter, you need water, you need this, and therefore we'll parachute them in. The question is not what you need, but how are you coping? Because that question simply then asks, helps you describe how are you coping at the moment? What are the roles of local civil society? What are the roles of the community? What are the roles of the local private sector? And how can we help that to perform better? So it's a shift from a resilience approach, I believe, is a shift from, or a fragile, sensitive approach is a shift from what do you need to how are you coping? And we have a wonderful panel here today. And we're going to really explore that question. So, sorry about my papers. Our panel, we have Dima. I'll introduce you, and then you can all come up. Okay. So we have Dima Mannoun, and she's an urban planner from Syria, and she will set the frame by just talking about her own family's experience of living in fragility over the last decade, and how communities and how that interaction has helped to foster resilience in this time and dignity at this time. We have Mathabo Makuta, the National Director for Habitat for Humanity in Zambia, and she will be talking about how does Habitat for Humanity support communities in informal settings, or slums as some people call it, to build up that sort of resilience and to build bridges with local government. We have Yue Sui, the director of Signify Foundation, who will be talking about how Signify is supporting communities to be resilient through providing lighting, but importantly, how this allows a community process and how to leverage that support to enable the voices, particularly of women, to engage in that process. And finally, we'll also have Olivia Nielsen. Sorry, not finally. We'll also have Olivia Nielsen, principal of Miyamoto Foundation, and Miyamoto International, sorry, who will talk about the important role of the private sector in providing, in responding to fragility and providing resilience. And then we also have Alexis Doucet, who is from Enabel, who will talk about the role of planning, of urban planning, in strengthening resilience at the community level. So without further ado, let me start with Dima. So Dima, you left Syria, I think, in 2015, a decade ago, to work as an urban planner in Europe. And many of your family members and friends have remained in Syria. So can you share with us, just to sort of set the scene, a little bit about how people that you know, your family members, have coped with a decade of fragility? Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Good afternoon for all. Thank you for bringing this question, which made me give me the opportunity to shed light on some aspect of urban Syrian community. So for those who remained in Syria, I can tell you from my experience that navigating the latent fragility of social security community has been an immense challenge. As you might know, that the Syrian crisis has not only destabilized society, but also has fractured the relationship between diverse religions and cultures. It disrupted the balance of living standards and incomes, deepening the societal divisions and reshaping the fabric of community across the country. The story I'm about to share actually reflecting those struggles and showing and demonstrating how, in absence of security provided by local authorities, individuals instinctively return to the fundamental forms of tribal cohesion. So this story actually it's my own, and it represents an experience for many middle-class Syrian families. My parents, both civil servants, my father a retired army officer and my mother a retired teacher. They both provided a comfortable and a stable life for their children over 25 years. This stability allowed us to enjoy a sense of security and belonging. When the crisis began, we were forced to leave our apartment in rural Damascus and move to our family house in rural Latakia, and this is in the coastal region in Syria. And coming from a minority background, we no longer felt safe in Damascus. However, after some time, we came back to Damascus for work, but we couldn't go back to our original place. Instead, we found ourselves moving between various temporary accommodations, attempting to cope uncertainty of the situation. And what compounded our search for housing, that Damascus neighborhoods had increasingly defined by social backgrounds, religions, and family ties and economic factors, which made finding an affordable house that both giving the feeling of physically safe and socially accepted was a huge challenge for us. In 2014, and due to a huge security incident, my parents decided to leave Damascus once again and go back to Latakia, where they stayed till 2018. And according to the ongoing economic and social challenges, eventually led my parents to decide to leave Latakia and go back to rural Damascus and live in our abandoned house. Despite this return, the recent events in 2024 promoted my family to leave Damascus once again and go back to our village house in rural Latakia. We could see this forced and repeated displacement was not only physical, but also deeply emotional and financially draining. Middle-class family in Syria, they grappled so many difficulties, and for this segment of community, social fragility became a defined reality, and they dealt with constant struggles to ensure and secure the essentials for a dignified life. And if I might also talking about the fact that fragility even existed in Syria even before the crisis. And this likely returned and due to a centralized and outdated planning system and its regulations. Like for Damascus, by example, this long-standing failure forced many to seek a shelter in informal settlement. When the crisis unfolded, the city experienced increasing in social fragility and reflected in the formulation those tiny knit communities. They influenced by religion and the tribal and ethnic affiliation. So those communities, those cohesive groups looked for their security and safety outside of the local authorities. This fragmentation shaped the city in kind of a patchwork of isolated zones, each one with its own identity and its security concerns. And this is reflecting somehow the urban planning situation for the moment in Syria. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think this reflects the same trends happen in different ways in so many other places. We saw in Iraq, for instance, that if you are a Shia person living in a predominantly Sunni area, you would move to a Shia community where you felt safer. It's natural. But I think what we see on one hand is that communities sort of step up to help cope. But also you have this kind of fragmentation, you know, so as you're building resilience, we have to be sort of, on one hand, supporting communities to cope better, but we also have to be not locking in a way, this kind of, what you mentioned was a patchwork of isolated communities, because essentially we need to get back to a well-functioning urban system, which means that you don't have isolated communities. And so that's one thing that we have to be thinking about now in the transition to resilience, is on one hand, how do we support communities to support their residents better, but how do we restore the relationships horizontally between communities, but also the relationship between communities and local government. So I think one thing, even while on these kind of topics became very popular in the last decade within the UN system of, when we started talking about humanitarian development, peace nexus, people like Cities Alliance, Habitat and others, we've been working with fragile communities for a long time, where we're actually using some of the similar processes. So we're now going to ask Mathabo to talk about her experience in working with informal settlements in Zambia in terms of doing the same, supporting communities to provide resilience and to provide services and to ensure no one's left behind, maybe interacting between communities on that sort of planning process, but also the interaction with local governments in order to, one of the reasons that they're fragile is that they've been ignored by local governments. So rebuilding that connection or establishing that connection so that institutions can play their rightful role in providing services. So what is your experience from Zambia that you can share with us in empowering communities and strengthening the link between communities and local authorities? Over to you, Mathabo.
Thank you very much. And also for the opportunity to come and share some of the lived experiences of Habitat for Humanity working directly with the communities and in particular in Zambia. Allow me to do the preamble of this topic by saying urban fragility is often created by social injustices. The case of the informal settlements in the city of Kabwe has been created by exclusion, discrimination, victimization, segregation, avoidance, and to a certain extent, failures of urban planning. The case that I'm going to illustrate in terms of how we restored communities' hope and dignity is the case of the city that used to be the mining town. That when the mining got closed, it left the communities with lead contaminated situation, that pollution had been affecting the communities. And of course, we believe that communities themselves are resources. And we also believe that communities have solutions for their own problems. All that we need to do is to include them, co-create solutions with them, accept them, and tolerate their ways of doing things. This will give them a sense of belonging and value. And this is what we as Habitat believed in, put people at the center of development and everything that we do. Community-driven solutions are key and can be powerful if we allow ourselves to work with them and not against them. Therefore, their voices, especially the women and youth around the decision-making tables, are very key. As Habitat, we saw an opportunity at the time when Town and Country Planning Act of 2015 in Zambia declared these informal settlements, including the Kabwe, as development areas. And intentionally, we moved in 2017, up to date, where we worked with communities, mobilized them to empower them with information, tools, and to a certain extent, resources, knowledge, which of course helps to build their own resilience for their future sustainability. Harnessing collective responsibility and accountability is very key amongst partners, and including the communities themselves, the public and the private, and provide social accountability, way of understanding to hold each other to account. The communities have the duty of responsibility, and we have governments as the duty of care. So let me say the how part of it, which I think is mostly important, how we have been doing it for these past many years that we have worked with these communities. Like I've mentioned, this is a devastated community that is affected emotionally, and some of the kids are mostly harmed, they are stunted, they cannot even progress through their education because of the lead contamination and become very affected. So we have done different interventions where many of those that we have done, we did the needs assessment. Of course, where the communities themselves give their own perspective, what they need, not what we want. Therefore, we worked around the issues of water provision, because this is critical for life, and this is where we have worked around with the partners in the government who are the duty bearers. Through the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding, that's where we clearly said what are our roles as duty bearers and us that are coming to support the communities. And in those MOUs, they give us the legitimacy to work with the communities. And we have signed in this regard with the Ministry of Water, Development, Sanitation, and the MOU with the quasi-government that are the regulators, the authorities that are regulating the standards and the quality. And of course, the private sector that is Lukanga Water that is working within this settlement, where I'm very proud to say, during the COVID, we became very innovative. We used to provide these hand-pump water boreholes, which of course during the COVID, it became a challenge. So we solarized the water sources to the extent where that has been attractive to African Development Bank. And because we have partnered with Lukanga Water and Sewerage Company, so ADB came on board to provide funding that now help to support 60% of the water sources in this area for reliable access to water. We have also done some work around housing. And of course, we as Habitat, we believe that all starts at home. A healthy and safe home is a critical foundation towards lifelong resilience and stability. We have been working around decongesting the informal settlements. That is housing 60,000 inhabitants in one Makululu informal settlement. And through working with the Municipal Council Kabwe, they have graciously allocated pieces of land for extended upgrading, which is a greenfield, which is, of course, is incremental, but with the hope of engaging the communities to understand their responsibilities, and we are empowering them to be the responsible citizens through their savings groups, right? So through the savings groups mechanisms, we have now created and have homegrown that interventions that has been existing within them by empowering them with digitalization that now links them to the financial institutions, which is a private bank called Zambia National Building Society. This is allowing them now to access affordable housing products. So lastly, I must also mention that the tenant security is very important. Through this declaration, people now are aspiring to own the security, the land rights, to be able to be resilient and take economical investments in their own areas. And this is very important in Africa. And it gives you that sense of dignity and hope. And that is what we are doing. And we are empowering them with the skills, like awareness campaigns. And lastly, the livelihood aspect of it is what we have supported these communities. And this is through the green gardens that we have communally done, through the municipal council that allocated pieces of land. And this gives nutritional value to these children that, of course, they are very challenged. And allow me to say, youth is very important to engage. We have been engaging the youth in the programs that we have done through sports for development, through what we called football sports 3 has been a tool that we have used. I think I will be guided as we progress, just to give you more of the in-depth of these initiatives that we did to build the community's resilience. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mathabo. And what I think is very interesting here, you're starting with an isolated community, but you're starting with respecting how they do it, what their culture is, and that is the starting point. And from there, you're able to create linkages then with institutions through the MOU, with government, with the water and sewage company, the service providers, with the community savings groups, with the African Development Bank, and then initiating a formalization process. And I think this really reflects that cities are systems and we have to work within ecosystems. And I think this is a really interesting point of going from building resilience by being part of an ecosystem and not just being an isolated community. So thanks very much for that example. You work with the director of Signify Foundation, which is part of Philips, that we provide lights. I won't give away too much of the game, so you can tell us a bit more about this. But what I was really interested in when we talked the other day is, while the asset that you're providing for communities, which is solar lighting, and is so important, but you can explain, what was important also is that you're using that asset to ensure a certain process. And that certain process was making sure that women were playing a key role in the planning. So I'd like you maybe to talk a little bit about what Signify Foundation is doing, but also how you're using that to amplify or enable the voices of women in that local decision-making process. So over to you, Yue. Thank you.
Thank you, Dyfed. I'll start by a short introduction of Signify Foundation. So we are a corporate foundation. The Signify, if you haven't heard, Philips Lighting. So it wouldn't surprise you when I say our primary mission is to enable access to light for the underserved. Well, the corporate foundation is a new breed, right, relatively. So it fits awkwardly into this private sector definition. We're not for-profit, we're charity, but we are very far away from ground realities to be called a local NGO, right? So we rely a lot on partnerships and look for projects where lighting amplifies the biggest impact. So we're relevant to this topic because most of our projects are in fragile settings, so mostly responding to humanitarian crisis. So over the past years, working in Syria, Lebanon, Ukraine, and Sudan, where David talked about communities coping in the conflict situations, and where we also see that communities, when they move, they're displaced, and they also missed access of infrastructure that they used to. So electricity being one, lighting being one. So there we provide solar portable or solar lighting solutions, right, for households, for essential services, schools and hospitals, and to at least make sure during this transition period there's safety, security installed, and also through electricity access, and people can stay in contact with each other, phone charging, very basic day-to-day needs. I'll give example for Syria. Over the past years, we been delivering solar portable lights for households, lights for women, for children, and by people with disabilities. And then quickly, as situation evolved, and we understood needs from the ground, and also supplied lights for hospitals. And now, who knows? We're still looking. We're still waiting for the new proposals to come to let us know where is most needed. And then David mentioned about the gender lens, and then that's what I want to double click and share more. So we absolutely focus on women unapologetically, and I see as the day evolves, and majority of this audience is women. So more comfortable shared with that as well. So why women? Because women are often coping in silence, and that is, it's not my opinion, right? It's just what it is. And personal story, on the panel we have three young mothers, and when we see each other in the eyes, we ask each other question, how many hours do you sleep? And you say, 2, or how about you, or 3? But if I talk to any person on the street, how are you doing? Great, right? So, well, that's the thing. When we talk about involving women in planning or in community development, there's a nuance that we miss, is that how to really effectively, meaningfully engage women, right? How to really understand their need, and then often is very gender specific, and the volatility that they might not want to share in a group setting, or they might not feel safe to share. So there we work a lot with the NGOs that focus on women and only women, where they create safe space, they empower women economically, socially, because a lot of societies, right, and the root cause of women not being included or involved in decision making is so deep that you need to unpack one after another, but it starts from gender empowerment in general, right? It's not an isolated topic. So we work with those organizations where through their programs, outreach, and creating safe space, and really creating the methodology and process to understand women's need. That works really well for us. So give you examples, and then I hope I can show the pictures, but it's not there yet. Oh, wow. Okay.
It's my slide.
It's not my slides. Should I just keep? Are they?
Maybe your slides are after.
Just zoom through and just keep it.
Getting a preview. Yeah, get a preview of mine.
Is this? Okay.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
No.
I think we lost. Sorry, keep going.
Oh, thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you.
No.
Continuing. Sorry for this.
Well, now you can only imagine. Yeah, I wanted to show you some results of the project. Yeah, after listening to what women really need, their vulnerability in Sudan, in the refugee settlements, that 20% of women are pregnant while displaced. So there, the biggest need is also for safe childbirth. So we provided solar portable lights for the midwives who otherwise would deliver baby under torchlights or phone lights, and also provided lighting to health facilities, to maternity wards. Yeah, because baby come when baby want to come, and it's typically in the night. So there, yeah, it's a small win, but then the system, of course, it's a lot of other needs that we really need to address, and hoping for collaboration with others as well. And then another example in Colombia, after having the engagement with women groups, we understand their needs living in the informal settlements or urban slums is that they miss the connection with people, the socializing life that they used to have. And they also wish that their children can continue studying and play after dark, because then when they move houses, when there is no infrastructure, no solar, no light outside, it makes the nightlife more difficult, right? And the routine becomes different for them. Yeah, so simply placing the lights outside their houses and in the community centers enables them to continue with their social life. And then an interesting case in Johannesburg in South Africa, where we did a survey with partners to understand people living in townships, right, and women, especially the ones that need to travel far to work and come back to attend to house needs. What's your challenge? And we understood that yeah, there's cute, right, and as mom, as women in the house, that you want to provide good care for your family. You want to make nutritious meal for your children, but you also want to work, and that's stopping a lot of women from doing both, right? And one of the solutions that we co-created with the community and with the partners is to set up a food dispensary on the way home, so closer to the townships, where women can pass and buy food for a day, buy salt for a day, and keep going back and providing meals for the family. And then there we also provided lighting, so the whole service can run after dark. So those are examples where you see the pictures that are very intuitive. Yeah, we really tried many different interventions, and because there's no community like another, right? And then as an NGO or as a charity, it's very easy for us to replicate solutions when we find something that works. But we really want to make sure that we don't do that. We don't make assumptions that we know anything about the community's need. Coming in any new project with the assumption that we are blind to what is the best for this community. So there we replicate more the process, the engagement process, having the two-way understanding and learning with our NGO partners on the ground, right? But then in all the projects, we try to really focus on women, because there's a saying, right? It's happy wife, happy life, but it's also in the communities when the women are helped to cope better, we believe the community, also the next generation, will thrive. Yeah, so that's the story I want to share. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And if there's more time, I'd love to know, how do you make sure that, you know, when you're working through partners and when you're working in so many different places, how do you manage to make sure that this process happens? And maybe we can come back to that if there's time later. But fantastic. And I think when we're looking at the root causes of fragility, you cannot look at the root causes without asking women, how are they dealing with this, and what should be done differently as we build back towards a resilient setting. So fantastic. I think having the voice of women in that moment of fragility and in that journey towards resilience is so crucial. So thank you so much for that. Alexis, Dima spoke about this kind of enclavization of society, during that coping process, because people are not supported so much by the institutions and they have to support themselves within a community that they feel safe and secure in. You're an urban planner, and Enabel is doing a lot of work with urban planning in fragile settings. And I'd love you to talk a little bit about how through urban planning you've managed to build those bridges between communities to make the city function better. And I think you should give us a short presentation on your work on public space in East Jerusalem, where you have very sort of divided, sort of enclavized communities. Over to you, Alexis.
Thank you. Yes, so I will discuss the question of public space in East Jerusalem, which is a very peculiar, fragile urban context, where exclusion is not necessarily due to a lack of resources or expertise, but it's really a result of political realities. So, as you know, the public space there is highly contested, shaped by the ongoing situation of occupation. So, you have here as an image that's Damascus Gate in Jerusalem. It's very beautiful space. But not everyone feels safe or welcome to use that space, as I will present a bit in my presentation. So I will be exploring our approach of semi-public spaces that we developed as Enabel in Jerusalem. So I'll not do the whole history of Jerusalem, of course. Sorry, I see, okay, the animations are not working. Okay, it's fine. So you can just see there, that's Jerusalem. You have in pink, this is the city, how it was under Israeli control until 1967. And following the Six-Day War in 1967, the municipal boundaries were dramatically increased, meaning that the whole Palestinian population of East Jerusalem lived under occupation ever since. And as you can see, you have also many Israeli settlements which were built inside East Jerusalem since then, which further fragmented the city and the connection between the people. You have the same city, but completely different urban conditions. Okay, Palestinians and Israelis, they pay exactly the same taxes, but they don't receive absolutely the same services. You have on the left a street in West Jerusalem where you have very nice infrastructure, tramway, and good quality of public space, and a street in East Jerusalem where you think that the public space is like an afterthought, and you see immediately that solid waste management, for example, is not really well done in the same way. So discrimination is a bit, everywhere in the city. So this was an image where, you were supposed to see it first without the soldiers and the settlers. And you could see that you had a very nice street that, feels like a very welcoming space. But depending on who you are, you live the space in a very different way. A bit as we mentioned that women can sometimes feel much more insecure in the public space. Well, in East Jerusalem, it's not so much about gender. It's much more about your national identity, of course. How can we find a space where people can feel safe and that is accessible to everyone? So we started to work on trying to develop semi-public spaces, which is basically trying to open the gates of spaces which were existing, sometimes schools, courtyard, NGO buildings, religious spaces, but we're like underused, and that could be made accessible to the public. So how we worked is basically we started by identify opportunities. And when I say identify opportunities, this is not about identifying a space that you find suitable. It is about finding an ongoing initiative where you see that there is already a management of space by people, and that you see that it's already functioning. So here you have on the left a very badly built canteen, which was already selling drinks outside of a sports field. So the space was functioning, but very underdeveloped. Then we engaged the people, and we started to take women and youth to visit other public spaces in West Jerusalem, in Tel Aviv, to really expose them to different reality that is really outside of their everyday experience. Then we had to negotiate. Of course, many of these spaces are privately owned, so you have to negotiate with the owners how you can make a deal with them, basically by providing them better infrastructure in exchange for opening these spaces larger amount of hours during the day. And then we co-created these spaces by co-designing them with end users, and because participation is not only about the design, we of course involve them in the implementation and activation of these spaces. So I'll just show you really a few examples so that you have a bit of pictures and not only words. This is okay, there was the before and after picture, but it's fine. So this is the after. It was a totally abandoned backyard of a private school where we negotiated that basically by developing a soccer field, basketball, and running tracks. They would be benefiting from these spaces during the school hours, but would make it open to the community after school hours. You have here a university campus. So it was, again, an existing space already working as a branch of a university inside the city. But it was totally underdeveloped. So by just developing the infrastructure, we managed to create a space where people can feel safe. And at the same time, it's being managed, maintained by a specific institution. You have here a cultural center, which is inside a mosque. In a very, very sensitive area where, it's very, very tense area. And by just helping developing the space inside, they could expand and provide cultural activities, music classes, and traditional dance. You have here just the roof of a NGO, which was already being used. That's the before picture is on the right. It was already accessible from the street, and so it was already used by the community as a gathering space. But we just further developed it. And here's the last piece. So you saw before the picture of the abandoned, the badly built canteen. So it was transformed as a better canteen and a kind of cafe, and we further expanded the public space there. So this is being managed not by the municipality, but by the sports club of the area. So this is a last slide to really conclude, is to say that, mainly this is a street in an informal neighborhood, Palestine one, and maybe the street in many respects, when it is narrow enough here, becomes also as a semi-public space where neighbors are really interacting with each other, where you can feel your children are safely playing, and that can really contribute to the resilience in fragile settings.
Thanks so much, Alexis. And absolutely, we're seeing that planning process is very tangible, and it's sometimes a quick win because it brings people together. And I think that can also stimulate then a further planning process when we're starting to look at infrastructure and other things that's needed at the city. So thanks very much for that example. One thing we haven't talked so much about yet is the private sector. And I often think in the UN we're a little bit scared to talk about the private sector because we don't really know them that well. Yet they are there. And everybody talks about, oh, we have to leverage the private sector, and often we don't really know what that means. So I'm very pleased that Olivia is here, private sector person. And she works with Miyamoto, and Miyamoto is often relied on in disaster situations because they build back better, that's their business. But not only that, they empower the local private sector. So let's talk a bit about the role of the private sector and how this is part of that ecosystem that enables that transition from fragility to resilience. Over to you, Olivia.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? So I have the pleasure of giving the last talk today. I'm going to stand up because I'm sleepy, and I think many of you are sleepy, and I just got to keep these legs moving. Okay, so I'm Olivia Nielsen. I work at Miyamoto. We are the evil private sector. No, but I think by the end of this presentation, you will understand why the private sector does a lot of good work, and I hope you can come see me afterwards with questions. So, quickly who we are. We're a global company, and we have resilience and humanitarian assistance in our DNA. In everything we have been doing all over the world, in all our offices, we really think about long-term resilience of the built environment. And we have, in fact, responded to over 100 disasters worldwide, and unfortunately, we are still counting them today. Oh boy, okay. This is not what the slide is supposed to look like, apologies. But we intervene before disasters to make cities more resilient, but we also intervene after them. And we have a ton of experience doing this all over the world, including a lot of fragile countries and emerging markets. And across our organization, we adopt a few principles, and I'm curious to see if these principles are the same for many of you in the room. But what we really try to do is find where we can have the maximum leverage, where we can affect the built environment, either by making it safer, more affordable, more sustainable before a disaster, or by building back better after one. How can we have the biggest bang for our buck, right? And so I'll discuss this in a minute with a few examples. But if you only have a little bit of money, how can you use it the most effectively? So we're trying to find the levers of impact, and this can be in the enabling environment, it can be in easy repairs, it can mean many different things, but that's always what we're looking for after disaster or before disaster. Because we are the private sector, we're not scared of the private sector. It's not a scary thing for us. We participate with the private sector, and in fact, most of our revenue comes from the private sector. At the end of the day, we are an engineering company. We entered Haiti in 2010, and guess what? We're still there. I think we're one of the only ones who are still there, and we're operating because, as someone said earlier, the funding, it comes, it goes, it stops, it starts. Well, if you're only relying on that funding, sure, but we're also working with hotels, we're working with the government, we're working with we're working with supermarkets. We have many different diversified sources of funding, and because we collaborate with the private sector, we know how they work. We know how they operate. We know what their challenges are. And so we understand the community, and especially the private sector. We try to always use, I should say, local labor and local resources. All our offices have local employees. We don't have any expats. I live in the US, and I only provide advice when it's needed. And local materials, I'll get back to this in a second. This has been a very interesting conversation today on that. And we always try to respect local culture and heritage, and I think that is super, super important. Last one, speed matters. After disaster, the sooner you can rebuild, the sooner you can get people back into their homes, the faster the recovery cycle is. And we really, really emphasize this. We need to move fast, but we need to do it correctly. So I'll give you a few examples of our work that we're doing. We're in Ukraine, we're rebuilding. We didn't wait for the war to end. We didn't wait for all the done money to come in flying, or for the master plans to be done, or even for the EU and the Americans to agree. Should we do rental housing or should we do home ownership? Because I've been caught in the middle of that debate. One worth having, but we've gone ahead, we've repaired schools, we've repaired housing units. The numbers seem quite impressive. Wow, 12,000 housing units repaired. Well, yes, it is impressive, but remember, we look for the maximum impact with the minimum spend. So that means that some of these housing units only needed minor repairs for the families to move back in, right? If you could just repair a few windows or repair a patched roof, something very minor, you can get a family back into their home right away, because the probability of a building being bombed twice, well, hopefully, is pretty low at this point. So let's go ahead, let's start rebuilding. Even if the conflict is still going, there are plenty of local laborers looking for work, and we want to get that moving. Another thing that we just released are the asbestos guidelines, and talking about fragility. Oh my God, you're being bombed, and now you're contaminated, right? Because 60% of rooftops in Ukraine have asbestos in them. And when was asbestos outlawed? I have it hit there. In 2017. It was outlawed in 2017. So you can imagine the amount of asbestos on the roofs, on the pipes, it's everywhere. I think every single construction material has it. So we're like, okay, well, we have to do something. We have all these humanitarian workers who are going to come in and rebuild soon, hopefully soon, right? When the war ends, money's hopefully going to come flowing. But there are no guidelines in place. Nobody knows how to recognize asbestos, how to deal with it, how to dispose of it, and it's going to create another crisis, another type of fragility in the decades to come, right? So how do you deal with this? Let's put it together now. We're not going to wait for the war to end. We can put together these guidelines now. Afghanistan. Well, we went there, not me personally, but a lot of us went there, and we saw, okay, well, there are all these amazing structures. Some of them withstood the earthquake very well. Others didn't. So we went back to the US and we used modern engineering software to figure out why. Why do some buildings suffer while others don't? And now that we know, and I'm not going to get into it, but we know why some do and some don't, we can go back and give those guidelines back to the people, help them repair better. Instead of coming in and imposing, okay, why don't you rebuild with concrete and cement blocks and do it this way? Well, no, you have everything you need right there. You have the rocks and the mud and the wood. You just have to modify it ever so slightly. And really, the modifications were so simple to increase the resilience of these structures. So we just went ahead and did that. A little piece of hope here. Again, I said we stayed in Haiti. We went to Haiti and we stayed. So we were able to see the results of our labor. After the earthquake, we worked with different donors and we trained a lot of masons. We trained a few thousand masons on how to rebuild back better. And then in 2021, we did a pop quiz in Port-au-Prince. We took a bunch of masons, random masons off the streets, and did a pop quiz. We made them build a wall. We made them build something and tried to see, did they really absorb everything we taught them? Are they actually rebuilding better? And guess what? I think it was, 80% of them passed. 80% of these random masons passed. And guess what? I think it was a very, very small ratio of them had actually been trained in the first place. These were not the people who had received the primary training. So that means that people who had received the primary training had continued to train other people, and the information was passed on and passed on and passed on. And now, without having to do anything, a decade later, and we were talking about the long-term results, Judy, the long-term results are surprising and I think give us hope. I just wanted to quickly, the World Economic Forum published the top 10 risks in the coming years, and then in the long term, right? So this is maybe a bit hard to read from where I am, but I'm a housing person. I love housing. I dream about housing, and I can see housing addressing most of these risks in the short term and the long term. It's going to address climate change. It's going to address inequality. It's going to address pollution. If you do housing well, you can address the world's main risks, right? We need to keep this in mind. Like, this is what the World Economic Forum is saying, but they're not saying housing is a solution. Well, I think it is a solution. And so this is kind of how I see myself. Thank you, ChatGPT. I think of myself as a housing detective. I go to a country and I look around, I ask a lot of questions, sometimes very uncomfortable questions, and I say, okay, why is it not working? Why is this specific market not working? Why are resilient, affordable, and sustainable housing not being built? And the answers can be quite surprising. I worked in DRC with Munya, and in DRC, every year, you have to go register your mortgage at the land title registry, which costs like 1 or 2% of the mortgage cost and takes about 6 months. Okay, wow, I wonder why nobody has mortgages in that country. In Bangladesh, it's a 33% tax every time you want to buy a house. So if your house costs $100,000, you have to pay $133,000. And then we're talking about subsidizing interest rates on mortgages. I'm like, oh, wait a minute. Maybe you should reduce this tax. Maybe you should do things a bit differently. So if we go to a country, I try to think about, if you were to change 3 things, 3 small things, what would they be to make housing in your urban environment more affordable, more sustainable, and more resilient? Thank you.
Amazing, thank you so much for that. So I'm actually a useless moderator, I have to admit, because I get too interested in what the panel is saying and I forget about timekeeping. So we've got about 15 minutes left and I want to open up the floor now. But we've talked about, what does it look like to, instead of ask what you need, how are you coping? And then how does that then open up the voices of women in the community? How does that help link communities to institutions and link communities with development banks and everybody else that can support? How does urban planning help to bring communities and local governments to co-create, etc.? How does that open up opportunities for the private sector just to build back better and to bring new cultures of working? So we've talked about that question, how we shift from what you need to how are you coping, and how can and that then links us to the next question, which I want to open the floor on. What does that mean for the future of development? What does that mean in terms of how development practice should take place in Fragility? And I'd like to open the floor and receive any comments, particularly on that question, but you're also welcome to comment on other things that you feel relevant. The floor's open, thank you. We have one hand at the back already.
Working?
Yeah, it's working.
Right.
Please introduce yourself. And then your comments.
My name is András Sekér. I'm from Habitat for Humanity, Germany. And thank you, Olivia, for pointing out the potential of adequate housing or people's realization of the right to housing in terms of realizing their true potential in all other aspects of life. I think, when you come from Habitat, that's what we believe. I also understood your comment about not worrying about ownership versus rental in the Ukraine in the humanitarian context. But wouldn't you think that in the reconstruction phase, it is rather a very important difference? And what do you and what do the panelists think about the rules around housing? Who has access? How? What does it cost? What rights do you have in terms of unleashing the potential of housing for human development? Because arguably the situation pre-war in Ukraine was there was a lot of housing, but for legal structural reasons, inequity reasons, it wasn't helping people to realize their potential. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We can maybe take a few other questions and then relevant colleagues on the panel can respond. Anyone else? Okay, let's respond to this. Maybe you can respond.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So I worked in Ukraine with the World Bank last year on a rent-to-own study, which is kind of right between rental and ownership, right? And it was very interesting because some parties were pushing ownership and some other parties were pushing rental, and people were very opinionated, let's put it that way. I mean, two things. I think when it comes to housing, the key is diversity and optionality. We need to provide people with an optionality of choices, because throughout your life, you live in many different types of housing, hopefully, right? And without optionality, we will not kind of empower the people to choose what is best for them, right? So that's one. So I think the debate was a little silly, because obviously we need both. But then second of all, how do you optimize the use of resources so it's fair? Well, that's a lot of the work we do, right? How do you make sure a mortgage subsidy is not higher for richer people and lower for lower, So that's a lot of the work we do, and it takes a lot of calibration. It's a lot of studies, a lot of calibration, and trial and error. And I think programs need to be adaptable, and that's something that we've learned, right, Judy, over the past years of the World Bank, is that, you might not get it right from the beginning, but if it's set in stone from the beginning and you can't make changes, then you're shooting yourself in the foot. You need to make sure that you can tweak the program to ensure it's fair and ethical. Yeah.
Do you have any other?
Okay, otherwise.
Do we have any other comments from the floor? Any questions, comments from the floor? I know two of my panelists here have some questions, but the floor's open. Okay, I think you have a question.
I always have questions, I'm sorry. But for my fellow panelists, when we're talking about community-driven urban design, how do you make sure that when you involve the community, you're not creating expectations that cannot be realized later on?
Yeah, that's a critique typically, right, for donors as well. Sometimes you go to a place and you ask a bunch of questions, create this expectation, hey, we're going to do something here, and you never come back. And, that's at least in the space where I operate. Yeah, it's not okay, of course. Because then the first thing is, when we talk about charity, especially the donors far away, and my principle is that you should have least interference in the process of local community-led programs, meaning that the information that you want to get from the communities, you go through the local organization. So they know the communities better, they might already have answers for you, and they can explain what the broader picture is to community better than you do. So yeah, we try not to have that direct landing on the spot, asking questions and leave the approach, but then really rely on the local communities to gather data, feedback, so that this bottom-up approach eventually that help guide the design of the project.
Mathabo, do you want to also answer that question? Thank you very much, Yue.
And of course, I would emphasize and re-emphasize the importance of local ownership. And the design must be culturally fitting in and appropriate. So I also want to concur with what Yue has said, that you must make sure that it's context-based. And the design is appropriately and culturally accepted. So our modern, I'm a planner by profession, but I think I have converted to be a community development planner. I have seen for so many years of practicing my professionalism in urban planning and urban design that often it doesn't work, because we always feel the way we have been taught from school is the best way. But we have to blend it with the localization in order for it to work. So that's how I would encourage that we urban planners be able to be context-based and be responsive to local needs of the designs that we are supporting for them to accept. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mathabo. And any other questions from the floor? Nothing coming up? Maybe we started with Dima, and I'd like to come back to you, Dima, just as a last question then. Syria moving forward, what are the things that are there any outtakes from here? I mean, it's a very complicated question, so I don't think we need to go too deeply, but what are the outtakes from this conversation that you think could be relevant for Syria moving forward? Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah, when the solutions come to Syria, the how question is too long. So I think all of those kind of interventions and solutions could fit in. But the question is how to start, from where to start, and with whom to start. For me, the most important to looking about which kind of model of governance could be there, which kind of networks should be built between stakeholders, including the local authorities or private sector, or and with the civil society. How to rebuild the trust between the communities and the local authorities. How we are building also this kind of coalitions that include and promoting connectivity and openness between all interests. I think this is how could be to reconnect those. I talked about those isolated spots, how to reconnect them, how to rebuild the trust, how to bring those communities who has a long-standing memory of neglect and being aside from decisions.
Thank you so much for that. I think that really helps to wrap things up. And I think just to close, I think what does this conversation mean? What does this mean in terms of the future of development? I think what we're seeing is that, to begin with, that cities are systems. They're fragile when the systems break down. Sometimes they're perpetually fragile when the inequality means that there are certain parts of the community that doesn't have access to that system. So as we're looking at that transition from fragility to resilience, it's about restoring that system in a way that works for all. And I think then to make a system work, you need an ecosystem of actors that make that work. There's the role of the local authority. We haven't talked very much about building that capacity of local authorities and local institutions, but there's that role. There's a role of the private sector, there's a role of communities, there's a role of stakeholders, particularly women, young people. It's an ecosystem of actors, and it takes an ecosystem to make a system work. At the next level, though, in terms of international aid, that's also an ecosystem. And that's also an ecosystem that's also fragmented. And I think the only way really we're going to move forward is we need the development actors, we need those people providing grants to be working with those people providing finance. We need to be bringing together the professional community. We need to be bringing together the private sector. I think at the moment, aid is not working well enough because those connections between that ecosystem of actors is not functional, and that's why a city doesn't work. Is when the ecosystem that makes it work is fragmented. So I think the takeaway from this, for me, then, is as we're looking at the future of sustainable development, we need to look at an ecosystem that's connected, and I think that means a lot of dialogue between development banks and development actors. That we need between the development actors and the private sector. We need everything to be, and between that academia, etc. So, thank you all for listening to this the conversation, and hopefully we can continue this conversation beyond today. And I just really want to thank my excellent panel, starting with Dima, Mannoun, Mathabo, Makuta, Yue Chui, Alex, Doucet, and Olivia Nielsen. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your moderation, Dyfed. Thank you all. Thank you all of you who remained in the room and everyone who's been following us online. This has been a very rich and dense conference. Thank you, Cities Alliance and Habitat for Humanity, for bringing us together. Our closing remarks will be given by Maria Fernanda Espinosa, President of Cities Alliance, and then Jonathan Rackford, CEO of Habitat for Humanity. As you like.
Well, we are reaching the end, which is a pity because it has been so incredibly rich and interesting what we have heard and shared today. And it's really very difficult to, say the closing last words without betraying the wealth of information, of very thoughtful, first-hand experience, either, the practitioners at the local level, the policymakers, the funders, the allies. It's extremely difficult, and believe me, it's I try to pack everything in this. I have very bad handwriting. I'm left-handed, but I was thinking, what can I say? And perhaps I'm told that I have 5 minutes, and I will try to use less than 5, and basically with some keywords or headlines, perhaps. And again, apologies for not, doing justice to everything we heard today. The number one headline would be not an afterthought, which means that the role of cities should be at the center not only of responses to fragility and vulnerability, but central to all sustainable development policies, investment, regulation, commitment at the center, because it is in urban settings when we see the worst and the best of humanity and of humankind. The poverty, the exclusion, the injustice, high carbon footprints, and we also see the best, and we saw what is the best of humankind in terms of solidarity, community building, generosity, innovation, creativity. So not an afterthought, but the epicenter of what we do. The number 2 headline would be horizontal and vertical. And because building inclusive urban development and turn fragility into resilience in a life with dignity will require horizontal integration, meaning social cohesion, community transformative agency, investing in inclusive public spaces, and we saw some of the pictures here, quality public services, social protection nets, and I really appreciated I heard many times the role of young people, of the younger generations as agents for transformation. And I also heard of course, with passion, the issue of a gender perspective, of a women's rights perspective, of women's needs, but also capacity to transform the urban environments. In the vertical meaning the multi-scale approach of collaborative work from communities to local governments, to national governments, to decision-making in the multilateral global spaces and back. In my experience, I know that global decision-making, when it is successful, when it is implementable, it has to be shaped and owned by the people who these policies are supposed to serve. So and also the role of the non-state actors, of organized civil society, of the private sector. I really, really appreciated the voices of the private sector here. I think that they do have a very important role to play. And I'm saying this because I know, most of my life I have been a public servant and interacting with a very complex UN environment. I have to say, when you say public sector, it is true. People, become nervous, and I really love, we're not afraid of the private sector because we are the private sector, and it's true. And I think that again, speaking from the multilateral global perspective, I don't think that we have learned how to use in full the potential of the private sector, how to make the rules for and with the private sector, and in how to include them in the big stuff, in the things that are needed. So that's regarding the vertical integration, and I think that the role of philanthropies are also important in all of this, and so that is okay. Oh. The number 3 headline would be scale up and innovate on financing resources. And I think that we are here, one of the reasons why we're here, because we need to and we want to ensure long-term, predictable, and sufficient funding. Blended finance, public finance, local government finance, a great role, untapped, I would say, of multilateral banks. And I think Julia, knows that very well from the World Bank. It's an untapped space because of the way, the modus operandi of multilateral banks, both the global but also the regional. And I think we heard today loud and clear that the best preventive investment to displacement, to migration, to conflict is to invest in fragile urban ecosystems and to really work from the reactive responses to urban planning and community building that is in this urban planning. Many of you were urban planners. I'm a geographer myself, and has to be participatory, owned socially, and shock resistant to address the crisis that we are facing today. And what I learn, at least today, sometimes we think about urban settings, especially fragile urban settings, as problems to solve, as I said this morning, but there are social, environmental, economic innovation hubs where we have a lot to learn from. So we have seen, and I have heard today, that many of the world's most effective policies on sustainability, on social equity, have emerged from local spaces and cities. So I think that the successes, the good practices should guide global strategies, and to demonstrate that, as I mentioned before, a multilateral global decision-making can only translate into tangible results at the local level and at the community level. Since we are in Europe, I would end by saying that I see Europe having to play a very important strategic role in reshaping resilient and sustainable urban future. And I think the expertise and the experience in climate action, in urban innovation, it's extremely important and much needed these days in terms of building strong partnerships, bringing in new additional and innovative finance. I think that that's basically the opportunity we have. And just to remind ourselves why we came here today, why we're here today, why we gathered today, it is because we want to build a poverty-free, fragility-free urban environments, cities without slums, cities for a life with dignity for all. So thank you very much for this incredible journey. Thank you to the Cities Alliance, to Habitat International, to this house also that has hosted us today, and to thank you to all the partners that are strong believers in the future, and a future that is not only building back better, but building back different. And yeah, so thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Munya, for your facilitation today. I want to add my thanks and really just leave us with a charge. I think Maria summed up so beautifully a really strong day. And I think sometimes as we think about what happens next, that's really the charge. So if you're here, if you're online today, you already get it. And I hope you learned a few things or get some new ideas or some principles that you can think about putting into action, whether you come from the marketplace, from the social sector, from the public sector. We need, as we've talked about it, all of that. And I think sometimes we can forget, we can jump right back to the basic story. First, we have to remind people how fundamental housing is to all the other things they want. And I think we haven't always had a strong enough narrative. And we need to make all those connections for people. If you care about economic development, you have to care about housing. If you care about educational outcomes, you have to care about housing. If you care about health outcomes, you need housing. If you want to deal with the climate crisis, you can't do that without dealing with housing. If we want to deal with migration, the greatest migration since World War II, it can't be solved without housing. Housing really is a prerequisite, certainly not the only need, but very much a prerequisite for all the other things we need. And we really need housing at the center. The bad news is we have the worst affordability crisis in modern times. I think the opportunity that comes out of that is that housing is now on the agenda. You can't talk to a mayor now, really anywhere in the world, without them saying housing is at the front of their challenges. And now it's become a big enough issue that at the federal and at the multinational level, housing is finally on the agenda. But now we have to turn that from being on the agenda to actually turning that into action. And as Maria said, we need Europe. There's a giant void in leadership now, and Europe can really be at the forefront of this conversation. A couple of asks I would make of you to think. These are small but important for us. One is Habitat for Humanity has an open letter to the European Commission calling for increased investments for fragile urban settings. And we would welcome all organizations to sign on with us. And separately, I mentioned earlier Habitat's Home Equals campaign, and we have a petition for the G7 in particular to take a leadership role on housing and to put housing as a higher priority. And we would love to have more support in that front. But most importantly, my hope is at least one idea today made you think a little bit differently or spurred thoughts about how you might partner differently in the way that you're addressing housing in whatever context that you're trying to help. And so, again, I want to say a huge thank you. We need to lock arms. It's going to take really everyone moving together to move at the scale that we need, and then thinking about what are the enabling environments, the conditions, the financing, the de-risking, all the elements that need to come together to massively increase the supply of housing. So thank you for engaging today. Thank you for robust conversations. Thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you to Cities Alliance. for your partnership and hosting, and wish that this is the beginning and not the end of the conversation. Thanks, everyone.
Well, I feel like we don't really want to leave. This has been so great. Thank you all for coming, and let's continue the conversation in other settings.